Welcome to Disasters Maybe, a podcast about disasters in contemporary fiction. I am Jordi Serrano Muñoz, and in this show, I talk with scholars and writers about what it means to invoke catastrophes when interpreting our present and our future. Living in, a collapsing world is, how can I put it, a bit stressful. Being reminded that our future might not be better than our past, that there is really no planet B, and that everything we, or maybe they, as in big corporations and leaders of the world, are doing to us and to the planet has no undo button. It has no control set combination. All of this can lead to feelings of despair, of dread, of even paralysis. People from all generations suffer distress, but it is particularly more acute in younger people, for teenagers who are constantly reminded that they will be both responsible actors and victims of the climate crisis. Ecoanxiety, term that perhaps gathers all these feelings, is also transmitted in fiction, in stories about young people coming of age when the world is slowly coming apart. However, the experience of the climate crisis is not the same for everyone, and there's no single model for how a teenager is. Questions of race, of class, of location in the world matter. And finally, there's also this question of how effective reading a book can be when processing these emotions, or also to instill this need to start acting, to start the revolution. In today's episode, I talk with Chiara Xausa, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Bologna and the University of Idaho, and a fellow Marie Curian who studies all of this, how literature deals with ecoanxiety, particularly in teenagers, and how the different experience of, perhaps, for instance, a teenager in the United States and another in Cameroon can meet. Enjoy. Chiara Xausa is a researcher at the University of Bologna and the University of Idaho, where she studies whether reading fiction about climate disaster can change how young people feel about the actual crisis happening around them. She specializes in understanding how novels about ecological collapse represent young people by looking at who they are written for, whose voices they center, and what solutions they imagine. And she's also about to find out soon-ish whether any of it works by putting these books in front of young people and, seeing what happens. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for being here.
Jordi, thank you for inviting me here.
So, Chiara, a lot of people, especially young people, are genuinely scared about the climate. And this is not in an abstract way, but quite literally losing sleep over the issue. We all remember the large demonstration by the end of the last decade, in 2019 more or less, and we have this image of Greta Thunberg shaming world leaders about their inaction with their shame on you, shame on you. But then the pandemic hit. The flames of demonstrations decayed, and today the standard advice tends to be very individual. Recycle more, fly less, drive less in a car, manage your own anxiety. Your research starts, however, from a different place. From what I have read, you think that fear is not just personal, that it's actually a political thing. And my first question then is, what do you mean by that, and why does it matter?
Okay, I think that one useful way to approach this question is to look at how climate anxiety is usually defined. So if you take something like the American Psychological Association, it's typically framed in clinical terms as an individual emotional response to environmental crises linked to risks perception, coping mechanisms, and mental health. So the implicit question becomes, how do individuals manage their anxiety? What that framing tends to obscure is that these emotions are not just personal, they are also shaped by the world people are living in. They reflect structures of inequality, responsibility, and exposure to harm. So when I say that climate fear is political, I mean that it's not just about how people feel, but about why they feel that way and under what conditions. There's also a broader context here. climate change is often presented as a technical problem, something to be managed through individual behavior or technological solutions. And the individualization of climate anxiety fits neatly into that logic because it relocates the problem inside people instead of asking what kind of system is producing these feelings in the first place. But if you look at youth climate movements, it becomes very clear that emotions are not just internal states, they are already political. So if we think about Greta Thunberg standing at the United Nations in 2019 and saying, "How dare you?" That's not just anxiety, it's anger directed outward. It's an accusation. It identifies responsibility and turns emotion into a claim about injustice. At the same time, these emotions are not experienced in the same way by everyone. They are uneven, just like the climate crisis itself. They are shaped by race, class, geography, and history, by who is more exposed to environmental harm and whose experiences are recognized. There's a moment in a 2022 documentary, which is titled Katrina Babies, that really stayed with me. So this film brings together testimonies from people who were children during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which is a majority Black city that was disproportionately affected by the disaster. So in one scene, there's a young woman that starts talking about what she went through, and she suddenly breaks down in tears. And when she's asked if she has ever spoken about it before, she says, "No, nobody ever asked me." And I think that moment is crucial because it shows that environmental distress is not just about what people feel, it's also about whether those feelings are heard, acknowledged, and given space. Some forms of climate suffering become highly visible, while others are structurally ignored or silenced. So when we treat climate anxiety purely as a mental health issue, we risk pathologizing what may actually be a very lucid response to the crisis. But if we understand it as socially and politically mediated, then it becomes something else as well, a way of registering harm, making inequality visible, and potentially opening up forms of collective response. So the question is not only how people feel, but what those feelings do, what kinds of claims they make, what kinds of futures they allow us to imagine.
It's a wonderful way to frame it, not just, as you said, not just how people feel, but also why, to not lose ourselves in trying to just understand what is happening, but try to establish links of responsibility that keep these questions in relation with the individual and the group. So basically, it's this idea that, of course, there are individual people suffering, and they are individual ways of suffer or suffering and living through these experiences, but they all relate to this collective thing. They all have this link of societal responsibility. It's interesting, though, you were mentioning this documentary, Katrina Babies, right? And you refer to a living person, and I'm wondering, how do you see that link between, documentary with living subjects and other parts of your research that have to do with fiction? And specifically, I see that you also focus on fiction that are books basically written for teenagers, or at least that have teenagers as their subject, as their main characters. It's very interesting also because, we don't want to get too lost on these debates about what is really young adult fiction, but this is a very strange and interesting space in between of not being books for adults, even though adults enjoy it, not being books for children, even though many children also want to start reading as soon as possible. It's this kind of literature. But I'm very interested in knowing why you chose to focus on teenagers specifically, and what kind of book that is written with this 17-year-old in mind do accomplish that maybe this very serious Booker Prize novel cannot, in your opinion?
I think the short answer is that teenagers are in a very specific position in relation to the climate crisis and to climate anxiety in particular. They're not just reading about the future, they are constantly being told that they are the future. Climate change is framed over and over again as something that will fully unfold in their lifetime, something they will have to deal with more than anyone else. So the emotional stakes are, of course, very different. And we know from recent studies that young people are among the most affected by climate anxiety. It's not just abstract concern, but really persistent fear, grief, even a sense of betrayal. And what's interesting is that young adult fiction speaks directly to that condition of growing up under crisis. It's not looking back, it's oriented forward. It asks, what does it mean to come of age when the future itself feels unstable? And formally, these books tend to use very immersive narrative techniques like first-person narration, diary formats, very close focalization, that bring readers into intimate proximity with the characters. There's a scholar in the field of utopian studies, Tom Moylan, that talks about this enlightening triangulation between three things: the reader, the fictional world, and the real world. What that means, in simpler terms, is that when you read speculative fiction, you're constantly moving between these levels. You experience the story from a limited personal perspective, usually through a young protagonist, but at the same time, you're seeing a transformed version of reality, a future shaped by climate collapse. And that back and forth can make you rethink your own words in a very concrete way. And I think this triangulation is especially powerful for teenage readers because their sense of the world is still forming. Their habits of thought are not fully fixed yet. So the gap between fiction and reality can become a space for imagining alternatives, for asking, what could be different? What could I do? And this is where young adult fiction can sometimes do something that a Booker Prize novel doesn't necessarily aim to do. It doesn't just represent crisis, it often stages agency. A lot of these books place young people at the center, not as passive victims, but as protagonists who act, resist, organize, and imagine change. Of course, there are tensions here. Some of these texts are very didactic. Some are quite conservative. Some fall back into familiar tropes. But at its best, young adult climate fiction creates a space where difficult emotions like fear, anger, helplessness are not just expressed, but worked through. So for me, the key point is this. These books are not just simpler or lesser literature. They are doing a different kind of work. They are engaging readers at a moment when the relationship to the future, emotionally, politically, imaginatively, is still being shaped. And that makes them incredibly important for thinking about how people come to understand and respond to the climate crisis.
I think it is a very powerful statement to consider how, and also something that other types of, let's say, climate fiction, either clarify or just like climate in fiction, tends to not underplay, let's say, which is the capacity of thinking agency beyond just thinking a response to a crisis, of just like being hopeful in the ways in which you give power, not just to people in power, or people who are, middle-aged adults in the positions of responsibility. So the millennials coming into this at this point, even though we still haven't yet crossed that barrier, but also thinking of you have actually more power than you think, or you can try to imagine yourself not just as a victim or as a passive victim of the circumstances, but also as a player of your own future in a circumstance in which the future is imagined as this dire and not really inviting place to go. You said also before that that the consequences of the climate crisis are not distributed equally. They don't affect everyone at the same speed, at the same scale, at the same degree. And well, you've written recently about 2 novels that also do this in very different ways, or at least represent characters that make choices about disasters in different ways. So you've compared A Children's Bible by Lydia Millet and How Beautiful We Were by Mbue. And these are different books. I mean, one follows a group of wealthy American teenagers, and the other is set in this West African village that is being poisoned by an oil company. The two of them are stories about ecological catastrophe, with their differences, of course, but they treat what looks like completely different types of suffering. So, in your experience or through working in this comparison, what does putting these two books side by side actually reveal for you?
Yeah, what interests me in putting these two novels side by side is that they seem at first completely different, but they are actually doing something very similar. So in both cases, we are following groups of young people dealing directly with environmental crises. So at the most basic level, both novels are about what it means to grow up in the middle of ecological disaster. At first glance, though, they seem to be set in completely different worlds, and they are set in completely different worlds. A Children's Bible is about relatively privileged American teenagers watching adult authority collapse around them. How Beautiful We Were is set, as you said, in a West African village devastated by oil extraction, where environmental harm is inseparable from colonial and corporate violence. And it's worth saying that these novels were also published almost at the same time, just 1 year apart. 2020, A Children's Bible; 2021, How Beautiful We Were, which makes the comparison even more striking. So you might think they are dealing with completely different kinds of suffering. But what becomes really interesting is that despite these differences, they rely on a very similar narrative structure. So in both novels, the story oscillates between an individual voice, a young girl in both cases, and a collective voice made up of a group of young people. So you get this constant movement between I and we, between personal experience and shared experience. And that formal choice really matters because it allows both novels to ask the same underlying question, which is how does environmental crisis become emotionally and politically legible for the young? And what I argue is that this oscillation between individual and collective narration is precisely what moves climate distress beyond the level of private feeling. It shows that fear, grief, and anger are not just happening inside individual characters. They are shared, negotiated, and shaped by broader structures of responsibility, inequality, and inherited failure. So in A Children's Bible, this produces a strong generational dynamic. The children increasingly see the adults not as protectors, but as people who fail them. So climate distress becomes a shared generational feeling, a sense that the future has been damaged or stolen. The collective voice helps them turn that feeling into something more than anxiety. It becomes accusation, moral judgment, even outrage directed towards the parents. How Beautiful We Were uses the same formal mechanism, but to a different effect. There too, we move between an individual perspective and a collective voice, but here that collective voice makes visible something else, which is the unequal distribution of environmental harm. In that novel, climate crisis is not a future threat, it's a present reality produced by extraction, colonial histories, and global inequality. And that's why the comparison matters so much to me. The two novels look very different on the surface, but they use the same narrative strategy to do two related things. One, A Children's Bible, collectivizes climate feeling. The other, How Beautiful We Were, makes climate injustice structurally visible. So the point is not simply that these are two different disasters, is that together they show that climate distress is both collective and uneven. It can be shared, but it is never experienced equally. And for me, that's exactly why narrative form matters. These novels show how narrative form, especially this movement between I and we, but also in both cases, the use of child focalization. Also, narrative form can turn private disaster into a social and political experience.
I know that you and I have worked in the past and are constantly working with this decolonial framing mind, which is something that many scholars in our field sometimes aspire desire to do, but some others don't really know how to actually do that. There's been like this long-running debate in the world of climate literature about whose stories get told and whose don't. And I'm going to also say whose stories get studied and whose don't. And the uncomfortable answer is that, well, most of the work, both literary work and also scholarly work, focuses on these, Western white and cis male characters. Some differences are there, but this is basically the prototype. And you've recognized this, and your work pushes back precisely against this standard. But let's get real. Is the conversation, in your view, actually shifting? Have you seen a move in the past few years towards actually recognizing this unevenness in the representation? Are we really in path for a more diverse representation of climate change in fiction?
Yeah, I think the conversation is shifting, and in very interesting ways. For a long time, as you said, many climate narratives, especially I will say in post-apocalyptic fiction, they have tended to imagine climate crisis through a relatively narrow perspective, often Western, male, and center on familiar figures like the scientist, the father most of the times, or the lone survivor. In those stories, the focus is frequently on survival or restoration, how to rebuild or preserve a way of life that is under threat. One of the limitations of that narrative model is that it can present climate change as if it were a universal human experience, when in fact it is very uneven, as we said. Climate crisis is shaped by race, gender, class, geography, colonial histories, by who is most exposed to harm and who is most protected from it. So I think the real question is not just whether we are seeing more diverse characters, but whether we are seeing different ways of telling climate histories. Different ideas of agency, responsibility, and the relationship between human and the environment. And there we can see some important developments. In recent years, there has been a growing body of feminist, indigenous, Black, postcolonial, queer climate writing that doesn't just diversify representation, but also brings in different perspectives on climate crisis, especially in terms of justice, inequality, and historical responsibility. At the same time, I think it's important to mention young adult climate fiction as well, because young people are often positioned in public discourse as the future victims of climate change, but their voices are not always really heard or taken seriously. So young adult fiction is one of the spaces where those perspectives are more central, where young people are not just represented as vulnerable, but as agents who think, feel, and act in the present. So what we're seeing is not just a broader range of characters, but a broader range of perspectives and narrative frameworks. Some of these works also challenge the idea of a single universal we of climate change by showing that for many communities, environmental crisis is not something that will happen in the future, but something that is already being lived. So yes, I think the field is changing. And what's particularly interesting is that some of the most compelling climate fiction today is not just expanding representation, but also rethinking what counts as a climate story in the first place, shifting the focus towards questions of justice and collective responsibility. But yeah, I do think it's changing a lot.
I want to recover this idea that you said at the beginning about how it is important to focus on fiction, young adult fiction, and how it imagines giving agency to teenagers, because there's this thing that is very, very interesting, at least to me, of your and very bold of your Marie Sklodowska-Curie project, which is that you're not just you're not just studying the books and the texts themselves, but you're also bringing them to the lab, so to speak. You're doing this empirical experiment in which you're going to give these books to a group of young readers and try to measure what changes through the experience of reading them. And of course, with this, there's always a real risk of the answer being, well, not much. Not much has changed from the experience of reading it. And so far, we've been talking about the potential of reading, and we've been assuming that potential. But maybe I want to close with this more provocative question of how do you face that potential risk? How do you try to measure that, and also to temper the expectations? And basically, what are you hoping to find through doing this exercise?
What I'm hoping to find is probably not a dramatic before and after transformation. And I think it's important to be honest about that. I'm not expecting a young person to read one novel and suddenly become a climate activist or to stop feeling anxious. In a way, the project starts from a more modest, but also more realistic question. What kinds of emotional, imaginative, and critical shifts can climate fiction make possible? And one of the things I'm especially interested in is whether these books can help young readers move from a feeling of isolated anxiety to something more articulate and more collected, as I was saying before. A lot of young people are already worried about climate change, but worry on its own can be paralyzing. So I want to understand whether reading and discussing young adult climate fiction can help them name those feelings more clearly, connect them to questions of justice and responsibility, and maybe see that these emotions are not just private burdens, but responses to a shared political condition. I'm also interested in whether these texts can foster what I call critical thinking rather than simply hope in a vague sense. I'm not looking for books to reassure young readers or to make them feel better in a simplistic way. In fact, some of these novels are very dark, unsettling, even disturbing, but that can still be productive, I think. What matters is whether they open a space in which fear, grief, anger, helplessness can be worked through rather than simply suppressed. And then there's another dimension, which is ecological citizenship. I'm interested in whether these stories encourage readers to imagine themselves not just as victims of future crises, but as people who are already implicated in questions of interdependence, responsibility, and collective action. And that doesn't necessarily mean activism in a narrow sense. Of course, it may mean a greater awareness of environmental injustice, a different understanding of the relationship between human and the non-human world, or a stronger sense that climate change is something social and political, not just natural or personal. Methodologically, that's why I'm combining close readings with workshops, surveys, and focus groups. This is something that I haven't done yet. I will do these experiments in 6 months or so. I'm interested not only in what the books seem to do on page, but in what actual readers do with them, how they talk about them, which emotions they recognize in them, what resonates, what doesn't, and whether the discussion itself changes the way they understand their own climate emotions. And that's very much in line with the field of empirical eco-criticism, which argues that if we want to know whether environmental stories matter, we have to study their impact directly rather than just assume it. And it also reminds us that the answer may be complex, partial, and sometimes surprising, maybe even in a negative way. But honestly, even a finding of not much, as you said in your question, will still be very interesting. If the impact is limited, that tells us something important too. Maybe not all narratives work in the same way. Maybe form matter, maybe context matters, maybe discussions matters as much as reading itself. In fact, empirical eco-criticism stresses exactly this point. The effects of literary reading depend not just on the text, but on readers, on form, on how texts are read and discussed. So what I'm hoping to find is not, of course, a miracle cure for climate anxiety, but evidence that literature can offer a meaningful space for negotiating eco-emotions, building critical awareness, and imagining more collective way of responding to the crisis. Maybe I'm mostly interested in the collective. So that's what I'm hoping to find.
I think it is a beautiful and wonderful piece of research. I'm looking forward, honestly, to reading the results, and but also I think it also to connect it with the beginning. It goes in the same line as in your approach to eco-anxiety. It's not just about looking at the what or what is and how it is, but it's the combination of the how and the why. And trying to look at precisely what are the affective the dimensions of it. How are people feeling through living this experience that is mediated by reading? Basically, not just trying to see does A lead to B, but trying to understand that journey, what happens in that journey, which I find honestly fascinating, Chiara. So thank you for being here and for sharing your research with us. And again, looking forward to keep reading on your research.
Thank you, Jordi. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.